I think you can all imagine how excited I am about this review. I've said many times just how much I like the Ezone line on this channel. I didn't talk about the last one that much just because it came out quite a bit before I started doing reviews, but now the 2025 Ezone 98 is here. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. Now there is a ton to talk about with this racket. I gotta give it to Yonex. Every time they put out a new frame, they make some serious changes, unlike some of the other brands. It's not just a new layup technology here, although that is part of it, but they've also changed the shape a little bit. They've made some other drastic changes to some specs, and I think we can all admit this paint job is also worth discussing. We're going to get into all of that, but I also quickly want to address the elephant in the room regarding what I told you guys about my ankle injury in that top 5 rackets of the year video. That obviously hasn't fully healed yet. I did decide to go out and play test this racket while also trying to basically keep any weight off of my right ankle that could potentially be damaging. It actually worked out pretty well, but obviously the footage isn't going to be quite as high intensity as usual. I do think I was still able to get a pretty good feel for what it has to offer, but I also want to put it through its paces a little bit more once I am fully healed. I also wanted to say thank you so much for all your kind words regarding my injury. It means a lot to have your support. I obviously want to be over it as quickly as possible, but it's also cool to know that I can still test product while rehabbing. Of course, one last little bit of housekeeping before we move on with the review. As usual, remember that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So let's talk about all the changes you need to know about with this Ezone 98, because there are quite a few, starting with this paint job. I mean, seriously, this is brave from Yonex. I personally don't dislike it, but I don't think it's going to be for everyone. It's bright light blue with a slight purple tinge to it. I think the proper name for this color is periwinkle. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. It's not what Ezone 98s have looked like in the past. I'd love to know what you guys think about it, but one thing's for sure, it definitely stands out. Now let's talk about the actual changes to the frame, starting with technology. Now this is hilarious because I think at least the vocal part of the tennis community wanted the next Ezone to be less dampened with better feel, and that's exactly the opposite of what they've done. They've kept vibration dampening mesh and actually added dampening material. I was kind of shocked when I read it. This new dampening tech is called Minilon, and Minilon is a type of Minamushi bagworm. Yes, they literally preferred putting worms in their rackets before giving us back the feel that we all loved with the DR98. It's also worth pointing out that we got worms in tennis rackets before GTA 6. Okay, I don't think there are actual worms in this tennis racket. You can go read up more on the tech if you want. But basically, they've placed this Minilon tech at the sides of the shaft to reduce vibrations by what they claim is 5.8% compared to the previous one, which is already a very dampened racket. They've also added what they call shockless grommets to the sides and bottom portion of the hoop here, which are also there to help soften up the feel on impact. You can sense the overall theme here. A lot of these technological changes are there to make the racket more comfortable and forgiving, but they haven't stopped at just layup technologies. They've also changed the actual design of the frame. I love when brands change something about the shape because so many of these companies are just kind of copy and pasting from one generation to the next, just adding new tech, but changing up the shape usually substantially changes playability. Now I will say, the design change here is quite subtle. It's not like the V-Core, which was so obviously different from the previous one, but the differences are there, and what they have done is quite important to the overall playability experience. The first thing is that they've lengthened the upper hoop and then they've thickened up the beam in there as well. It's not too visually obvious, but it is similar to what they did with the V-Core in that it is a little bit more squared off around here. And that, combined with the thicker beam, is supposed to expand the sweet spot and help with power. They've also widened the beam horizontally. The way they're saying it is that they've extended the taper on the inner frame. I think it basically means that the frame is getting wider this way pretty much all around while still keeping that arrow angle design. It's a little confusing, especially because it's not that obvious when you actually look at the racket, but boiled down simply, it just feels like there's a bit more frame in general. The beam itself is a little bit thicker, it's wider, and what having more material in the frame does is make the racket more resilient to off-center hits. So the design is pretty consistent with the tech in terms of making the racket more forgiving, and there is one more big change to mention, the actual stiffness of the frame. Now I tested this one and the previous one on the same machine, strung the same way, on the same day, so even if the machine is a little off, it really doesn't matter. The previous one came in at 63 RA strung. This one was all the way down at 58. That's way softer, and I was really surprised when I tested it because I didn't think they were going to make the Ezone this soft again since it had become a little bit more power-oriented recently, but they have. Now keep in mind, soft might sound more control-focused, but when you factor in all the other changes they've made, I still think this racket is made to be more powerful and forgiving. In a way, they've kind of clashified it. Super easy on the arm, really low swing weight, really stable at that low swing weight because of its big sweet spot, and that did worry me at first. That's not necessarily what I would have wanted for this racket, and I think some other Ezone purists might agree, but despite what some of us are very vocal about, I don't know if that opinion is true for everyone. The reality is, Yonex knows better what works for their brand. The previous Ezone is one of the most dampened, user-friendly ones we've seen, and it may very well be that it was their most successful. Going this direction does make it more accessible to a wider variety of players, so I can understand it from their perspective. That's all theory based off of the tech specs though. I am going to get into how it actually feels on court here in a second. But first, I just want to go over the remaining important specs. It's still a 305 gram 16x19 with a 98 square inch head size. The stiffness I've already talked about. It went from 63 RA strung on the previous one to 58 now with this one, at least on our machine. Now with that wider beam in the top portion of the hoop, it goes to 23.8 millimeters here instead of 23.5. The rest of the beam is the same, 24.5 in the middle, and then obviously that paper thin 19.5 millimeter throat. The swing weight was pretty much the same. This one was 314 strung, which I know is a little bit low for a 98, but that's kind of the whole idea with making the sweet spot bigger, is that you make it more playable at a lower swing weight. So obviously there's a ton to unpack. I do want to say there might be times where I make it sound like there's a huge difference between this one and the last. There's not, but it's a bigger difference than what a lot of the other brands are doing from one generation to the next. So I am going to try and explain as specifically as I can what you should expect, of course, starting with feel. I think feel is what everyone is most curious about on this new Ezone, and yes, it has changed quite a bit. It's probably the biggest update coming from the previous one. That Ezone was already a huge change on the one it replaced. It was similarly dampened because of VDM, but much more forgiving, which I found made it even less connected to the ball, and that was because they thickened up the whole frame by 0.5 millimeter. They've made this one even more forgiving by expanding the sweet spot with that tech and design, and they've also made it feel significantly softer, obviously with that huge drop in stiffness that I mentioned. Now it is important to understand that this isn't just a soft, flexible racket like old school control frames or even older soft versions of the Ezone. I brought out the DR98 for this playtest because I wanted to feel exactly how much has changed compared to this one, especially because they have pretty much the same RA. The DR98 is a soft, flexible racket with a ton of feel because there's not much dampening that gets in the way of you and the ball. The new Ezone feels very soft, but it's much more of a mushy, dampened type of soft, which is much less connected to the ball, but also significantly more forgiving. I really want to hammer home that forgiving element because it's not like they're doing this whole dampening, bigger sweet spot thing just to hurt the feel. It has a massive effect on how the racket responds when you make contact off center. The DR98 certainly isn't the most punishing racket, but compared to the new one, it is much harder to use. This new Ezone is so forgiving, and that's what they've managed to achieve with more tech. It is a little bit more clashy in that regard. It's also pretty cool to experience head-to-head such a massive difference in feel between these two. They're only about 8 years apart, they have the same stiffness, and yet they feel so different. The new Ezone is so much more modern, it almost makes the DR98 feel ancient, which is so weird to say because back then, this was an Ezone. It was already considered a much more modern and user-friendly 98, but not compared to this. Now, whether you think sacrificing a bit of feel and connection to the ball is worth what you gain in user-friendliness is really a personal choice, but what I will say is that I played better with the new one despite enjoying hitting with the DR a little bit more. Now, compared to the previous Ezone, they're both muted. This one is obviously way softer, and I don't actually think that muted feel has gotten worse. If anything, I think that dampening matches the softer flex a little bit better. To me, the dampened and soft feel on this one is a little bit more natural than the dampened and stiffer feel that was on this one. It's almost like the previous one is a little more artificial because a racket this stiff isn't supposed to be this mushy, if that makes sense. Take this with a slight pinch of salt because I couldn't test it for that long and I played way better with the new Ezone, so naturally I liked it a little more. But I would need more time to say whether it point blank actually has better feel. There is one other very interesting thing I want to talk about with feel, and that's the way this frame actually flexes compared to the old one. Because they've widened the beam horizontally, I couldn't help but feel like the flex was a little bit more uniform throughout the frame, especially because it feels sturdier in the throat. That does make it a little bit less Ezone-y, you could say, one of the unique aspects of an Ezone is that there is such a distinct flex between their thick hoop and their super thin throat. It's almost like the difference between a Y-shaped throat and a V-shaped throat like you see on a Prestige versus a Blade, for example. The V-shape has a wider hold of the hoop, so it stays sturdier. That's what I would say the new one feels like because of that extra bit of width, but keep in mind this is, again, really, really subtle. Whether you prefer it or not kind of depends, and I do want to make it clear, I still felt like I was hitting an Ezone 98 the whole time. Don't worry about that. I also have to say that all these changes have helped to make it so playable in stock form that I didn't think about adding lead or even a leather grip, which even with the previous one I thought did do better with some weight in the handle. Comfort has also improved. I know some people had issues with the last one despite it being super dampened. I don't think anyone's going to have a problem with this one because it has gotten so much softer. Alright, so that was a lot of chatting about the feel, but it is really important to understand because feel, flex, all that good stuff, it directly impacts control, power, and spin, so let's talk about control. Usually when you hear things like thicker beam, wider beam, more dampening, you automatically kind of think less control. A softer flex would maybe help with that a little bit, but I went into this thinking this was going to be less controlled and less precise in general. That was not my experience on court. The most obvious difference between the new Ezone and the old Ezone is that the new one actually feels a little bit more consistent and less launchy. Now, launchy is not a problem I would ever have said I had with the previous one, but testing them side by side like this, and keep in mind, I had them strung the same way, unfortunately with different colors of Polytour Pro, but that is what I felt. That change I was talking about earlier with this racket having a more uniform flex thanks to the wider beam, I felt like that created a smoother transition between the hoop and the throat, and that, combined with this much softer flex, is what makes the launch more predictable. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, it's not a massive difference, but it is worth noting. I was actually really impressed with the control here because I thought a softer and more dampened layup would end up being stickier and more launchy, but it wasn't like that at all. I had a super easy time controlling the ball. It's definitely not a traditional controlled experience like what you get on rackets that are soft with no technology and constant beams, but I really enjoyed it, much to my surprise, by the way. I'm not kidding, guys. I was really worried about this racket. I also think what they've done with the control here is actually in line with what the Ezone 98 is supposed to represent. The whole point of the Ezone originally was to make a controlled player's frame that was much more forgiving than average for a 98. They've clearly prioritized the more forgiving element here, but they've managed to do that without hurting control. It is a different control experience than the previous one, but I definitely don't think it's gotten any worse by any stretch of the imagination. You could argue precision is a little lower because the sweet spot is bigger, but I had no issues picking my spot, and it's not like the previous one was a scalpel either. The previous Ezone was one of the most powerful Ezones ever because they had thickened the beam up compared to the one it replaced, and thickening up the beam is one of the most efficient ways of making a racket more powerful. The changes they've made here are a bit more subtle, but a thicker beam in the hoop, a more open top portion of the hoop, and a wider beam, those are also design changes that make a frame more powerful. They've also claimed that power was a major point of emphasis in the marketing, and I do agree that from an easy depth standpoint, this racket is more powerful than the previous one. Because it feels a little bit more solid and stable on impact, it pushes the ball deeper with less effort. It's also more forgiving on off-center hits, and all that goes along with this whole theme of making the racket easier to use. I don't think this racket has as much top-end power as the previous one, though. This has more to do with how the racket actually plows through and punches into the ball. I do feel like I can rip it a little harder with the V7. Remember, they have lowered the flex pretty significantly, so while the design is more sturdy, which helps with easy power, the dwell time is longer, and a longer dwell time means the frame soaks up more of the ball's energy during pocketing. Again, it's definitely not a huge difference, but I did consistently feel when I was pressing on the gas with both rackets that the previous one just had a bit more oomph to it. Of course, you can add some lead in the hoop to boost swing weight here, which would help with plow-through, but you'd also be making the racket harder to swing at that point, so really it's up to you. I will say that this slight decrease in top-end power is another change that makes this racket a little bit less Ezone-y. That is part of the beauty behind the Ezone's unique flex. That thick hoop can really launch the ball, and then the soft throat still gives you good control. And because they've kind of blurred those lines, there's a little less of that. It's not super noticeable. You probably wouldn't even think twice about it if you're not testing them back to back like this. But that was one little thing I figured was worth mentioning. But it's still an Ezone. Power is much higher than average for a 98. It's not just power that makes the Ezone 98 so good, it's also special because it has a really impressive amount of spin for a 98. It's maybe not quite as high as true modern spin rackets like the V-Core, Aero, and the Extreme Pro, but it's again higher than average for this head size. That hasn't changed here. In fact, I didn't notice a marked increase or decrease in the amount of spin it can produce, but as has been the theme with this review, there is a small difference with what you should expect when hitting spin shots. It goes back to this frame design, especially the part where they made the inner beam a little wider by extending the taper. It feels like the frame is a touch more aerodynamic because of this, so you can whip it through the air a little quicker, which is good for spin, but it's not nearly enough to have me say this racket is better for spin than the last one. The only other thing I'll say is that it's so playable in stock form that you don't need to add any weight that might slow it down. That's obviously good because it stays nice and quick, which is important for spin generation. Now, I was a little bit worried that all this dampening and softer flex would make the string snapback stickier and the racket less spin friendly. That's something I feel on the Gravity MP, for example, but definitely not here. You still get a really responsive feel from the string bed, so tons of spin potential, and that's, again, the beauty of the Ezone being one of those new era control rackets that's so good at all those things you need in the modern game. This new Ezone fascinates me because over the last year, I thought the big change would be servo filter instead of VDM, which would liven up the feel and then everything else would stay the same. I would have been really happy with that, and I'm not gonna lie, when I saw the marketing for this one, my initial reaction was disappointment, but I had a really good time testing it. I think they've done really good work. The changes do make it a little more forgiving, but without really taking away from what makes the Ezone so special. It's still a racket that combines control and power, and I actually think I prefer the way they've achieved it here compared to the last one. It almost feels like the last one was already going in this direction in terms of being really user-friendly and forgiving, but they didn't go all the way. This one just feels a little bit more complete with that playability in mind. The major thing is that it is going to be more accessible because of all those things. More easy depth, a more forgiving feel, and it's of course more comfortable. I have to say, I really like it, and that's quite surprising considering I wanted it to be less dampened, and it is at least as dampened. I always keep an open mind with these things. I never try to say that what I want is necessarily better or right, and I think this is really good at what it's supposed to be. And by the way, just because I keep saying it's gotten more user-friendly, definitely doesn't mean it's not still going to work for very advanced players. That Ezone DNA is still very much so there. I don't think it's actually going to disappoint players who have historically liked the Ezone, as long as you know you're getting into something a little bit different. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching. The Ezone won't be available for demo until January 10th, and if you do want to buy it, that's when you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.